So here's the thing, we all want to find our way back to our authentic self. But how do we do that, right? That's the question that we're looking at today. And I'm going to give you some insight into how I do it. Not that I'm perfect, because I'm still, a work in progress, as I do think we all are. By the way, I'm Kim. I am a spiritual wellness coach. I am a mystical truth teller. I don't know. These are some of the things people have told me. I'm definitely an astrology nerd for sure, and I am a spiritual wellness coach. I like to help people remember who they are, who they were, before people told them who they should be, before the world got loud, right? Today we're talking about conditioning. We've been talking about that quite regularly. It's something I talk about a lot because it is the chief culprit of why you are not living the life that really feels in alignment with you, right? So, just as a recap, right? Conditioning is basically these invisible rules that, you know, you never agreed to follow, but just kind of somehow fell into, right? And there's a lot of tools out there that people use to determine and try to figure it out and try to dissect it and decondition, right? I just happen to use astrology, tarot, and shadow work. And today we're going to focus a lot on astrology just as the main focus because, astrology's here. It can be fun and entertaining, sure. I know plenty of people that love to talk about it, but if you really use it as a tool, as a way that I kind of think it was intended to be used, it's not here to call you out. It's here to kind of show you the patterns. It's here to show you where maybe that autopilot button, that self-driving car button, has been pushed a little too long. I want to make this a little bit too, right? So let's do a quick reality check. Conditioning, like I said, are behaviors that, yes, are maybe not told you have to do, but they're learned behaviors, right? But sometimes that conditioning is also the thing that kept you safe, especially for those, and I've said this before, especially for those that grew up in a house where it was unstable, where there was maybe some mental health issues, maybe where there was some abuse, right? Some of these conditionings kept you safe in that moment. And that's beautiful. We should never, I think oftentimes when people are talking about deconditioning, they make everything seem so bad, but we should honor those autopilot learned behaviors that we had because they were viable and they were important in a certain point of our life, right? The problem is if they stay with us the whole time, then they could be potentially kind of keeping us small, kind of keeping us like confined, right? So these patterns come from, like I said, family dynamics for sure, but also cultural, right? If you grew up in a culturally conservative area, you may have shut down your more, I don't know, I hate to use the word liberal, but more, you know, non-conservative thoughts, right? Maybe culturally you were expected to be married and have kids and all that, and it's not really what you want, but you did it anyways, right? These are things that are happening, right? And like I said, they come from old emotional survival strategies, right? So all of this plays a part in your conditioning. So here's where astrology kind of exposes them. And really, truthfully, it's throughout your entire astrology chart. But what I want to talk about in particular are the big three. So the sun, the moon, and the rising. That's what astrologers call the big three, right? The sun is who you were told to be, right? Not who you actually are. And the moon is like your emotional reflexes, the ones that you didn't choose, right? Maybe you inherited them, right? And then the rising is that acceptable version of you, right? That was built for approval, not truth. These are conditioning wise, right? So if you decondition them, think about that, because once you can see these conditionings, you can stop blaming yourself and really start choosing more in alignment with who you are. So let's talk about how to use astrology as a pattern decoder. All right. Astrology is a map, just like everything else. I like to call it like your blueprint. So, when you're an architect, you draw up your first blueprint, right? And then people come in and maybe they want to change this, they want to add a room, and they want to make a renovation here, right? There's different layers. So you have the original blueprint, which is your original astrology chart. And then you have the conditioned you, which is where everybody has made renovations and added on and took things off and maybe sealed up access to certain things. This is kind of how I look at the blueprint, how I look at the astrology chart in general. So let's look. Unfiltered, the sun is your core identity, right? But when it is filtered, it becomes like almost forced to be like socially palatable when you express yourself, right? And don't get me wrong, what I want to pause for a second, but don't get me wrong, there are moments where you have to utilize these skills still, right? So maybe I'm a Capricorn Sun, so maybe I was told that productivity equals your worth, right? There are times where that might be true. If I'm working, that might be true in a working situation, right? But in general, productivity does not tell me what I'm worth. It tells me what I've done and what I can do, but it doesn't tell me my worth, right? So looking at the conditioning, these skills may still be viable in certain aspects of your life, right? What I'm trying to allow women in general to learn is that using that in that aspect of life is perfectly acceptable, but it shouldn't control your whole life. It shouldn't make you feel bad if you have a day off and you don't get anything done because you just don't have the energy, right? That's your day off. That's your time. You shouldn't feel like you need to be productive all the time, right? In order to be worthy of attention, of love, or your success, or whatever you're looking for. That's where it comes in, where you kind of have to be mindful of these things. Now, the moon is your like emotional muscle memory, right? So this moon usually has a lot to do with like family conditioning, right? And this is where things like that live rent free, right? Where maybe you learned not to express your emotions because you wanted quiet in the house, right? And if you said something, somebody get mad and there'd be yelling and there'd be screaming, and then people would say things like, "Oh, like you're just being stupid, like shut up," things like that, right? So you learn to be quiet, to not express your emotions, right? Now with the rising, this is like rising is kind of like the impression people get. It's like your first impression energy, right? And this mask is something that a lot of us forget that we can remove, right? So sometimes you have to have that first impression, right? If you're going out for a job, you've got to like go to the 9 yards, right? Right? You're going on a date, you want that first impression to be good. So maybe you put the mask on for that moment. But guess what? That mask, in order to have any kind of sustainable relationship, whether that be you know, career wise, personal wise, romance wise, whatever, that mask eventually has to come down. It can't stay on all the time. Because if it does, then no one is actually seeing like the real you, right? So let's get a little multidimensional, because I've mentioned it on here before, but I like to use something I call the 3 keys method. And that is where I use Western, Vedic, and Draconic to kind of decondition gradually the different stages, right? So if we're looking at your astrology chart, your Western astrology chart, we're going to be looking at deconditioning personality and habits. Things that, the person that you built in order to survive or in order to fit in or whatever that is, that would be in this situation, right? Habits, things you do, maybe out of habit, right? When we skip over to the Vedic astrology, this is where we're going to look at karmic patterns, generational things, right? why do I keep doing this kind of energy, right? Why do I, I think it goes a lot back to, we have to look at our parents, as in like most psychology, right? But their parents did stuff too, and then their parents and their parents. So you may be doing stuff just out of habit because that's just how it was done in your family, and it may not be healthy for you because you're just picking up inherited habits and traits and thoughts and ideas, right? So in the end, we're looking at personality, past lessons, and what is really your soul truth, right? The good thing about astrology is, unlike some things, it doesn't really it doesn't really shame you, right? It just really shows you where you've adapted, and adaptation is not bad unless you were forced to adapt, right? I did a TikTok about the difference between um, like flexibility and adaptability, right? Flexibility is when you adapt because you want to, right? But the other option is adapting because you had to, right? So there's a difference, right? It also, astrology can also show you where you're ready to evolve. And I think that's important. For me, that's one of the most important things. Unfortunately, you can't evolve till you address the issues that got you to where you were in the first place, right? Speaking of, how do you spot those condition patterns? So this is where like that mystical aura around astrology kind of becomes a little bit more practical, if I'm honest, right? So things you need to do. You need to watch for repetition, right? Same triggers, same reactions, same stuck points, right? So when you watch for that repetition and you spot it, you can then kind of say, well, why am I doing that? Why do I do that every single time, right? So I'll give you a little insight into me, right? This is going to be very personal, but I want to feel us to feel like we can talk like this. So when I get in like big fights, like I cry, like I just cry, and I know a lot of people do that, right? And it's the same repetition every time I get in it. I feel I cry, and then like I start like you know, I don't get like physical with anybody, but like I'll punch walls or I'll slap tables or right. And I was like, why do I do that? This is just an argument. It's and everything. And I had to look at where it came from, right? And also when I get in those situations, I become kind of like almost like I never blame the other person. It's always me. So it's like, well, what did I do wrong? Uh, why am I not enough? Right? I mean, I've worked through this and I don't do this as much, but back when I did used to do this a lot, and I had to look at where that came from. And it was a learned behavior. It was the way that I saw things happen. So once I realized that, I could then look and see and say, okay, well, this argument is this because I'm not enough? No. Is this my fault? Partially, but not completely. Right? Why am I crying? What is that going to do? Sometimes you need to cry for release. I'm never going to say that, but in those situations, it didn't feel like it was a release. Once I noticed it, it felt very performative. Not to say that every time I cried in an argument, I was like faking it. It just felt like that's what I thought I was supposed to do, so I did it. Right? As opposed to just feeling the emotions blowing up and just crying, because I do that too. I'm a Cancer moon, so it happens. Anyways, so I realized that, and I had to analyze it, and I had to really sit with it, and I had to sit with the discomfort. And then the next time I got in a big argument, you know what? I didn't cry. I might have teared up, because in that moment, it didn't. I really didn't feel like I needed to do it, right? So you have to look at those things. Anyways, let's go. You ask. You need to ask sharper questions. Like I said, I had to ask: is this actually me? Who benefits if I stay like this, right? Like, who benefits? And it wasn't me. And it wasn't the other person. Nobody benefited from this, because once I got to that point, we couldn't have a calm, rational conversation, or even a rational conversation. Even if it wasn't calm, we couldn't have that, right? When we look at astrology, here's the thing. That's noticing. That's kind of like just typical like psychology work, like therapy work, right? So we want to talk about astrology. So where can we get a sign of there being some conditioning in our chart, right? Honestly, there's a lot of them, but I'm going to give you a couple ideas, right? So you have Sun and Moon tension, right? That's inner conflict versus conditioning hotspot, right? So for example, I am a Capricorn Sun and a Cancer Moon, right? So that is a Sun and Moon tension. Because Capricorn wants control and achievement and emotional self-sufficiency, and Cancer needs safety and emotional connection and nurturing. So this led to me kind of being the strong one for everyone, right? I wouldn't really ask for things emotionally because I needed to stay functional for everybody else. And then I did feel guilty when I did need someone to give me some emotional support, right? Because that's just how my body and energy runs, right? So I overworked to avoid vulnerability. Sometimes I would keep working, and then you wouldn't see me there, right? And then I would be unhappy because people wouldn't show up for me, and that was hard, right? So I had to really look at letting that ambition that I have, um, and my emotional needs. I had to allow those two to be together at the same time. They had to coexist. By the way, this is in my Western astrology, not anything else, right? In my Vedic, I'm a Sagittarius Sun and a Gemini Moon. So I had to not let success dim my more soft parts, right? And then I had to allow myself to need support and be capable of accepting it, right? Other things we could look at is like challenging personal planet aspects, and this is kind of like survival strategies in disguise. So things like look in your chart if you have Venus square Saturn. That could be, you may feel like love needs to be earned. Affection comes with conditions, right? And that's often shows up as like emotional withholding, or maybe attracting unavailable partners, or over functioning in relationships where like you try to do everything. You know, the idea is if I'm perfect, I'll be chosen, right? What you have to reframe that as is like love isn't a performance, right? And you can't be secure if you're denying yourself, right? That kind of thing. So I think also another thing, if we look at Vedic astrology, you have karmic indicators. So old scripts, long memory kind of idea. So for instance, if Rahu is in the 10th house, but Ketu is in the 4th, right? Past life or ancestral patterns, right? So emotional entanglement, over identification with family roles. Maybe for this lifetime, it's like public achievement, recognition. You have to build authority outside the home. But the conditioning comes where like you're chasing success to avoid emotional intimacy, or you're feeling unsafe, slowing down, right? The soul is trying to learn something. What it's trying to learn is success without emotional abandonment. So you can be successful without giving up the softer parts of you, right? And you don't have to exile yourself to be seen, right? You don't have to pull yourself out of the situation to be seen. That kind of thing. Those sort of things. So, like I said, there's support tools that you can use. Astrology is definitely one of them, but also accompanying with astrology, tarot is very helpful. Shadow journaling, right? Tracking emotional reactions, all super important. I like to call some things like I do like micro rebellions, right? Because I'm a Capricorn and a Cancer Moon and Cancer rising, so not super rebellious. I have my rebellious points, But little micro ones I feel okay with. So things like speaking up when, like, before maybe you would have stayed quiet, right? That's micro rebellion. Uh, Instead of just automatically doing everything everyone wants to do as a people pleaser, trust me, I was, and still in some ways with some people am. Um, Pause before you do that. Make sure you really want to do the things you're saying yes to, and then how about choosing alignment over comfort? Because sometimes when you're trying to get into alignment, there is a bit of uncomfortability that has to be there because you're doing something new, and the human brain and the human body likes familiarity because it feels safe, even if it's not safe. If it's something you're perpetually involved in, it feels known, right? And sometimes the known isn't safe, you know? The truth is your body is going to tell you, right? If you feel like you're floating or you're expanding, that's good. If you're tightness, that's conditioning, right? So how do we break the spell of reclaiming alignment? Well, here's the thing. Awareness kind of cracks that door open, right? So acknowledging it, seeing it, noticing it. Once alignment kicks it in, that door is going to be basically blown off the door hinges. You have to get a new door, right? So in order to stay in alignment, to start the process, you need to really feel like you're honoring your sun, your moon, and your rising, even when it feels inconvenient, right? So you can do this with, you can focus yourself a little bit more by using rituals and journaling. You can do tarot, whatever it is, right? The thing that I want to say to you guys is you have to expect some discomfort, like I said. You have to, because conditioning feels normal and known, right? And it hates to be questioned. It doesn't mean that you're wrong for questioning it. It just means it's going to feel very uncomfortable as you're working your way towards freedom, right? Freedom is built by small and repeated brave choices, right? And that's what it is, you know. And I always want to say, astrology doesn't dictate your life, guys. It does not. What it does is it hands you the keys to the doors you need to open in order to find that path that really feels good in your soul, right? Look, I know everybody's like, oh, I'm a Capricorn, oh, I'm a Gemini, this. Astrology is really not about labels. It is a tool for liberation. I want everybody to see that. So, what I would say is, as we wrap up, is start noticing patterns. What are your default settings, right? Emotional reflexes. Take a look at that and experiment with the truth. Let your authenticity be louder than your conditioning, right? And that's what I think I'm going to say. So, by the way, just as a reminder, I'm Kim, and your real self isn't lost, right? And you don't need to be fixed. You just have to get back to yourself and allow yourself to get back to that place. So, as always, guys, keep questioning, keep choosing, and reclaim your energy on purpose. Have a great day, guys.